What's up, everybody? So I recently did a video talking about the characters that I think might be going to Dead Man's Hand in the future. And obviously that's a bit of a sensitive subject because nobody wants to see their favorite characters get killed and removed from the game. But of course we don't actually know if that's going to happen again or what Wyrd is planning to do with the whole Dead Man's Hand thing. But I thought it would be kind of fun to flip it on its head and get a little bit more positive here and talk about ways that we might see some of the Dead Man's Hand characters get brought back into the fiction. Ever since Dead Man's Hand got announced, people have been speculating about different ways that all of the characters could be reintroduced to the game, and I think each one of them has a pretty clear path as to how they would be brought back in if that's the direction Wyrd decides to go. So what I'll do is I'll go over a quick overview of how each one of them got removed from the game, and then I'll go over my theory as to how I think each of them could be brought back to the game. Honestly, I think there's a pretty good chance that at least some of these characters get brought back because they're obviously some pretty important characters in the lore, and I think it would be a really big deal for Wyrd to announce something like, Lilith's return to the game. I think that's something that would get people really excited, and it could potentially bring some old veterans of the game back to the system who haven't played in quite a while. But let's take them one at a time, and I think we're going to start off with Ramos. So just a little bit of background on Ramos' story up until this point. He was the leader of the Miners and Steamfitters Union, as well as the Arcanists, which is the more terrorist-y side of the organization. But over the course of the time that he was running both organizations, he had been out on this quest to find a soulstone geode, which is a super big, super powerful soulstone that he wanted to power his Leviathan, which is this big giant construct that he was going to use to try to take over Malifaux City. So he was off up in the mountains trying to find the soulstone geode, and he basically left Karis and Tony Ironsides in charge of the Arcanists and the Union, respectively. At that point, the new Governor General had just come into power, and he approached Tony Ironsides and basically offered her a deal. The Guild needed help capturing Ramos, and in exchange, they offered to put pressure on the United States in order to pass universal suffrage. And this was an issue that was pretty near and dear to Ironsides' heart because both of her parents were former slaves in the United States. So obviously, it's a very complicated decision to make, but she ends up deciding that that is a good deal, and she cooperates with the Guild to have Ramos captured. This sort of leaves Karis as the de facto leader of the Arcanists, and it leaves Ironsides as the de facto leader of the Miners and Steamfitters Union, and obviously that gets into a whole other story about their power struggle and the dynamics between the two of them. But as for Ramos, he gets thrown in prison in Malifaux, and then eventually he's actually transferred to Vienna, which is where the Guild's current headquarters are, Earthside. Now, aside from a brief instance where we see somebody trying to assassinate him in a second edition story, we don't really get to hear much from Ramos as far as like what he's up to in prison or what's going on, what kind of conditions he lives in or anything like that. And we also don't know if he's made any kind of attempts to break out or if he's tried to get some folks from the outside to come in and break him out. But we do know that he's in communication with some of the folks from the Arcanists because Damien and Colette have received letters from him and things like that. He also left behind a lot of resources and these safe houses that have these traps built into them, and there's all kinds of stuff that he was doing in the background before he got thrown in jail. So he still had a little bit of an influence on the story, but not in any real direct way, and he's been pretty quiet since he's been in jail for the past couple of years. Now, I think he's the character that's maybe the most straightforward as far as the ways that he could get brought back into the story, because he's just in prison. Like, he's not dead or missing or anything like that. He's just locked up. But just to touch on it, I think there are two main ways that we might see him get released from prison. I think one would be if he got broken out by somebody on the outside, and then I think the other would be if, for whatever reason, the Guild decides to release him. I don't think it's very likely that he's just going to break out on his own, because if that was going to be the case, I don't know why he wouldn't have done it already. I think something would have to happen to give him the opportunity to get broken out, and we know that he's in prison with his metal arm missing, and he's got a magical control collar on so that he can't do any kind of magic. So I think it's unlikely that he just gets out on his own. Now, it would be pretty tough for anybody to spring him from prison because the Guild, even though their power is kind of waning Earthside, they're still a very powerful organization, and Vienna is sort of their headquarters where they theoretically have the most power. So it seems like it would be pretty tough if somebody wanted to sort of assault the prison that he was being kept in and break him out. But crazier things have definitely happened, and with magic and all kinds of secret agents and spies and people that can teleport themselves and go invisible and all these types of things, it's definitely possible that somebody could kind of sneak in, infiltrate that prison, and break Ramos out. But then the question becomes, who would want to do that? Obviously, he's got a lot of old allies in the Arcanist movement, and the Arcanists have ties to different organizations Earthside, like the King's Empire. And they're not super happy about the Guild, and they kind of cooperate grudgingly with the Guild because of all of the existential threats on Earth. But I could see a scenario where they might be incentivized to break Ramos out, but he doesn't really seem like he's that important to the Arcanists anymore. It seems like they've kind of moved on without him, and a lot of the folks that were his allies, quote unquote, don't really like him, didn't really like him. Seems like a lot of people are kind of relieved that he's gone. Colette certainly is happy that he's out of the picture. I think Ironsides, at least to an extent, believes that they're better off without him. I think Karis is probably the only one that would be like really eager to break him out because he's kind of like a father figure to her. And I feel like even if she tried to recruit people from the King's Empire to help out, that would be a little bit of a step too far for them because they want to kind of continue cooperating with the guild. And I feel like a direct attack against them would be crossing a line. Plus, I don't really see the benefit to them, right? What would be the real incentive for them to break Ramos out, except for maybe to get him to power up some of their constructs? But they're kind of already doing that. I don't really see why they would need Ramos. A really interesting one would be for the Abyssinians to go break him out because obviously their whole thing is big constructs with lots of legs, and they're kind of a little bit of kindred spirits with Ramos in that sense because he's kind of into the same type of stuff, and maybe they could learn from each other and come up with some interesting new technologies. But for a lot of the same reasons, I don't think we'll see the Abyssinians just go assaulting the guild stronghold because that would cause way too many political issues, and I feel like they're doing pretty good with their own constructs. I'm not sure they really need Ramos to help them out. Now, maybe an organization like the Explorer Society or the Court of Two maybe even could decide that they have a particular reason why they want Ramos as an ally, and they might go try to sneak in and pull him out of there. But again, that seems like a little bit of a stretch. I think we would need another reason in the narrative why Ramos became very important. I think as things are, there's no real incentive for any of these organizations to want to risk pissing the guild off that much just to get Ramos out, because aside from being like a pretty charismatic leader that the people of Malifaux kind of like, he just does robot magic. I mean, it's not that crazy. It's not that big of a deal. I don't see it being a game changer for any of them enough that they would want to go cause a direct conflict with the guild. So maybe the more interesting question would be a reason why the guild would decide to just let Ramos out. And this is where I think we get into something that might actually be kind of plausible. I can see a couple of different scenarios where somebody uses their political influence and sort of negotiates with the guild to try to get Ramos released as like a prisoner exchange or just a kind of act of goodwill. And that's where I think something like the Abyssinians might come in, where they might negotiate with the guild and say, hey, we want this guy because he has some technology or he can help us out with this particular problem we have with our constructs. And in exchange, they get some sort of political or trade incentive or soul stones or whatever. Again, a little bit of a stretch. I think the more likely scenario would be that the guild would just choose to let Ramos go of their own volition. And the reason that I say that's likely is because I think that the main thing that Ramos being released from prison would do is undermine the Arcanists. I think if he got released and he got sent back to Malifaux and was allowed to just sort of go back to doing his thing, I think the only thing that does is shake up the dynamics of the Arcanists and make things even worse for them. We just sort of saw things calm down between Ironsides and Karis after they kind of had a big fist fight and sort of got over their differences, and they've been kind of cooperating with each other. But it's definitely tense, and you definitely get the sense that the people are still a little bit divided between the two of them. And I think that if Ramos got put back into the picture, that would shake things up again and cause even more problems. I'm sure Karis would be super excited to have him back, but she's kind of been doing her own thing in ways that I'm not sure Ramos would be super happy about. So there could be conflict even between the two of them, and I know for sure that Tony's not going to be happy about it. Even though she doesn't super love being the leader of the Miners and Steamfitters Union, I think that would cause all sorts of conflict between pretty much everybody. Colette definitely isn't going to be happy. Marcus and Rasputina probably just don't care. And we don't really know how Damien feels about the whole situation. But I think there's a good chance that this would be a way to sort of reignite the conflict within the Arcanists as a faction. And we also know that the guild's specialty is sort of undermining enemy governments and sort of subverting different organizations. So I would not be surprised if somebody high up in the guild just said, hey, you know what would be a fun time? Let's just send him back to Malifaux and see where the pieces fall. That might be a little bit anticlimactic from a storytelling perspective, so maybe they'd have to come up with a reason or like a justification for why they would do something like that, but I feel like it would not be beneath the guild to come up with some story as to why this was the thing they had to do. Maybe they even make a deal directly with Ramos where he's going to do something for them in exchange for being released. So they'd sort of be killing two birds with one stone. They'd get some intel or some benefit from Ramos directly, and then also his presence would serve as a sort of chaotic element in the Arcanists. Anyway, it breaks down. I think it would be interesting to see him come back to the game, and I think it would be even more interesting if he came back not just as the leader of the Arcanists in the same way that he was before. I think something has to change. So maybe the story becomes about him trying to regain his power, or maybe he goes and joins some other organization in order to try to kind of continue pursuing his own ends. Because we know that he's kind of at this point more obsessed with getting the Soulstone Geode and powering the Leviathan than he is with actually leading the Miners and Steamfitters Union. So maybe he hooks up with some of the Outcasts or the Explorer Society, because I bet they would be kind of interested in figuring out how that whole thing works and using the Leviathan for their own purposes. Either way, it would be interesting, and it would be even more interesting to see what happens with all the models that were in his keyword that sort of go with him, because if he ends up in another faction, then some of those models have to switch or just stay in his keyword. It'll be interesting to see what they do with it. Hey, don't forget to like the video and make sure you subscribe to the channel. I know it seems like a really small thing, but it actually really helps out the channel a lot by making sure that the YouTube algorithm will recommend this video to more people. In addition, you can check out all the links in the description below, including the Wyrd affiliate link where you can shop on their store and support the channel while you do it. My own merch store where you can pick up Defective Dice merchandise, like t-shirts and mugs and things like that. As well as a Patreon where you can support me on a couple of different tiers and get all sorts of different benefits, like ad-free versions of the videos, early access to videos, extra entries into the giveaways that I do occasionally, and all sorts of other cool stuff like that. But with that, let's get back to saving the Dead Man's Hand Masters. But moving on, let's talk about the true queen of the Neverborn, Lilith. Now, ever since first edition, we've known that Lilith had a sister, Nekima, who was a little bit more of the violent, kind of short-tempered side of the family. Lilith is certainly violent, but she is a little bit more of a tactician. She's a little bit more cunning. And we also find out later that she's also kind of interested in leading the Neverborn to be a little bit more civilized and a little bit more organized instead of just being kind of brutish savages. And we've also since found out that Nekima had originally thought that she had earned the throne of the Neverborn after she killed off a lot of the humans and kicked us back out through the breach the first time it opened. But when she came back to claim the throne after this glorious victory, she found that Lilith had already manipulated a bunch of the other powerful Neverborn to support her, and she had already claimed the throne as queen. So Nekima's been pissed off about that for a really long time, and over the course of the early lore, we see that she makes some moves and eventually decides to go after Lilith, particularly with the help of Titania. Lilith had Pandora and Zoraida on her side, Pandora a little bit less so. But with Titania's help, Nekima was able to mobilize enough of the Neverborn that followed her, and they sort of ambushed Lilith and her followers in the forest. There was this big battle, and Lilith actually recruited the Dreamer and Nightmare, who she didn't know was Nightmare. But in spite of that, she ends up facing off against Nekima, and they have a duel. Now, Nekima is obviously much bigger and much stronger, and Lilith is smaller but faster, and she tries to use that to her advantage, but it doesn't work out, and Nekima ends up stabbing her through the stomach. She then gets chased off by Nightmare, so Zoraida and Dreamer have an opportunity to try to save her, and they bring her back to Zoraida's hut, but Nightmare actually convinces Dreamer to hide a bunch of soul stones that Zoraida was going to use to heal Lilith, and so they're just left in this predicament where Lilith is about to die, and there's not anything they can do to help her. So Zoraida decides that she's got an idea, and she brings them to Nythera, which is the place where Titania had actually been entombed for centuries, and they decide to throw her into Nythera, where she will be sort of held in stasis and kept alive, but she'll be sort of out of the picture. Now, it seems to me like it would have been easier to just go find some other soul stones to heal her with, and Zoraida at least seemed to think that she would be able to just heal this wound with some soul stones. There's no particular reason why she had to die of this wound. It seems like it was just a time pressure, like they had to do something very quickly to stabilize her. So in theory, if she got pulled out of Nythera, a soul stone should just be able to fix the problem, I guess? I don't know exactly how that's supposed to work. But either way, she gets thrown in Nythera. But interestingly, just as she's being locked in the tomb, she discovers that Lord Chompy Bits is actually Nightmare the Tyrant, which is something that none of the Neverborn knew up until this point. Now, based on what we know in that story, I don't know why they wouldn't be able to just grab some soul stones, go to Nythera, take Lilith out, and heal her. It doesn't seem like there's anything that would stop them from doing that. Certainly Zoraida should know how to do that, because she seems to know how Nythera works, at least to an extent. And she seemed to be under the impression before that just some soul stones would do the job. But maybe the idea there is that if they just let Lilith back out, then her sister or Titania are just going to go find her while she's weak and finish her off anyway, so she's better off being protected in Nythera while they figure out whatever else they want to do. At least at the time, it was kind of only Zoraida who cared enough or would have been interested in saving Lilith, because they were allies, and Pandora is kind of off being crazy. and fighting with 2 tyrants over her body and being insane. She's just doing Pandora stuff. So she's not really interested in helping Lilith at this point, at least it seems. But interestingly, since then, we have gotten Castor back into the picture, who is Lilith and Nikima's uncle. Now, we know that Castor was one of the Neverborn that supported Lilith's claim to the throne originally when Nikima and her were sort of vying for it. And interestingly, Nikima's actually the one who goes and wakes up Castor, but he's aware, and now she is aware, that Lilith may not actually be dead. It seems like she sort of thought that she killed Lilith, but then she got chased off before she actually saw Lilith die. So she didn't even necessarily know that Lilith is alive this whole time. But she knows that her living blade is missing, which is sort of a big deal, because if she died in the forest, somebody would have claimed that living blade. So I think Castor is probably the beginning of the sort of groundwork of a story where we might see Lilith come back. We know that Castor is a pretty intelligent guy, and we know that he supported Lilith in the past, which leads me to believe that he probably won't like the way that Nikima is going to lead the Neverborn, because she's got a very different approach to things than her sister does. So I wouldn't be surprised if, as the relationship between Nikima and Castor develops, we start to see him indicating that he's not super happy with her, and maybe he'll even make contact with Zoraida and figure out the way that he could actually go and save Lilith. We know that he's allied with Barbaros. We've never seen that in the lore necessarily, but we know that Barbaros is in his keyword, and Barbaros is obviously a loyalist, so much so that he's Neverborn that's not allowed to work with the other Nephilim in the Nephilim keyword, if Nikima is the leader. So maybe between Castor, Zoraida, and Barbaros, they all decide that the time is right and that they have to go get Lilith out of Nythera and save her life so that she can come reclaim her title as the true queen of the Neverborn. I don't know what that's going to mean for Nikima, but we do know that Nikima's got some kind of bad thing coming up in the future, because according to Euripides, the hungering darkness is going to do bad things to her. So maybe she gets addicted to the magic crack and has a hard time continuing to lead the Neverborn, and that's why they decide to go pull Lilith out to bail them out, I guess. I don't know. Either way, I want to see Lilith come back and reclaim her title, and I think that'll be a really interesting thing to happen, because the way that her and Titania and Nikima and Zoraida and all the power dynamics and the who's going to be the leader and who's going to reclaim the title, it'll be really interesting, and it'll kind of shake things up a bit. Up until this point, there's always kind of been 2 factions within the Neverborn that are kind of working against each other, with a few other ones sort of on the periphery. And I think if Lilith come back, it'll be kind of interesting, because then there's sort of 3 factions. You have the Titania faction, the Nikima faction, and the Lilith faction. But it'll also be really interesting because we know that Nikima knows that Nightmare is a tyrant. So what that's going to mean for the Dreamer and Lord Chompy Bits, who knows? Maybe the way that it goes is she comes back and it actually unites all the rest of the Neverborn against the Dreamer and Lord Chompy Bits, because they know that he's a tyrant and they all really don't like tyrants. If there's one thing that's going to bring all of the Neverborn together, and it's not going to be just hatred of humans, then hatred of the tyrants is probably the next best thing. But with that, let's move on to Nicodem. So Nicodem is interesting because he's the character who actually got voted off the island. Back in the day, there was actually a community vote between Lady Justice and Nicodem, because they were being set up to have this sort of confrontation, and one of them was going to be killed in that fight, and we actually got to decide who was going to lose. Now, the setup here is that Lady Justice has been trying to hunt down all of these really powerful resurrectionists for a really long time, ever since there was resurrectionists at all. And for years and years and years, she's never actually eliminated any of the really powerful ones. They've hunted some undead, and they've killed some of the minor resurrectionists, but there's these important named characters, namely the masters in the game, who they've never actually been able to track down or eliminate. And when Nicodem actually leads an attack on the guild and almost wins if it wasn't for the Ten Thunders getting in the way, plus the assault on the guild enclave when they were trying to do the ritual and McMorning was revealed as a resurrectionist, it really got the fires going under Lady Justice to try to track down the other resurrectionists and try to eliminate some of them. She also needed a win because she was getting a lot of pressure from Governor General Marlowe, who was kind of telling her that she was going to basically be retired and turned into the poster child for the guild as opposed to an actual zombie hunter. So interestingly, Yan Lo and Chiaki actually sort of manipulate events behind the scenes to get Nicodem and Lady Justice together so that they can have this final clash. And Lady Justice identifies the mansion that he was using as a safe house and assaults it with the help of Daciel and some of the guild guards. Now, he tries to sneak out through an underground tunnel and come up in a graveyard where he can kind of summon some reinforcements to help fend off the Death Marshals, but they had actually seen that coming and gone to the graveyard ahead of time to lock down some of the graves so that he couldn't raise more undead. So Justice and the judge end up chasing down Nicodem, and interestingly, he actually turns and is able to control two of the Death Marshals because they have enough influence by necromantic magic and they're sort of undeady themselves that he's actually able to control them like they were zombies, and he gets them to shoot at the judge and Lady Justice. The judge actually catches the bullet and dies, but then Justice comes back and rages out and attacks Nicodem and kills him. She actually cuts his head off and then cuts his body up into little pieces and takes his head and leaves. And then the last thing that we see is that there was a soulstone in his pocket, which was actually charged by his death, and Mortimer comes over and collects that soulstone. Now, whether or not somebody's actual soul or mind exists in a soulstone when it's charged by their death is a little bit inconsistent. There are some indications in the lore that people's personality actually persists in the soulstone, so that if you use it, for example, to power a construct, a bit of your personality is actually kind of left over there. But it's not really something that has been explored a whole lot. But I do think that the groundwork has already been set up for Nicodem coming back from the dead, because if you go back and look at first edition lore, there's an entire story arc between Nicodem and Karai that was a pretty important story in particularly the second book of first edition. Basically, Nicodem has this issue where he raises zombies from the dead and uses them to fight for him, but they're not very coordinated and they're not very good at fighting. They can kind of hold a sword and a gun, but they're not good at shooting or swinging the sword. They just kind of shamble around and do zombie things. So his idea was that if he could actually get a soul or a ghost to embody those undead, that would sort of be the perfect combination to get his undead to sort of fight a lot more efficiently, because they need a sort of mind that can inhabit the body to control it a little bit better. And when he meets Karai, he decides that she's the perfect person to help him with this, because her thing is that she can summon and control ghosts, at least to an extent. So what he was trying to do is get her to summon ghosts and put them in his zombies to sort of combine them Voltron style and turn them into much better fighters. Now, we never really see that go anywhere. Karai has a hard time summoning the ghosts at first, and then they don't really seem to meld together that well, but that was sort of the idea that he was going for. And I think this really lays the groundwork for the way that we could see him come back. Karai's abilities have obviously gotten much more powerful over the course of that time, and we've seen her sort of develop those abilities through her interactions with the Court of Two. And she's even gotten to the point where she was almost able to bring the lost love back, her ex-boyfriend, Francis Kitchener. So whether it be through the soulstone that has his soul in it, or through some different ritual that Karai might be able to figure out how to do, I wouldn't be surprised if we see Karai bringing her old mentor back through some sort of arcane ritual, and either he comes back just as a ghost, or he comes back and she actually puts him into a body. Now, maybe that body won't look like Nicodem, the one that we know, but either way, it would still be Nicodem to an extent. And I think that opens up a lot of interesting possibilities for what he's going to look like if he does come back. Personally, I think it would be cooler if he just came back as like a lich or a ghost, but I think there's definitely a possibility that he comes back in some more corporeal form. And I don't really see any reason why he wouldn't still have a lot of the abilities that he used to have, because we know that kind of going to the realm of the dead and coming back was always his thing. His avatar form is basically like the king of the dead, and it seems like he has the ability to sort of move back and forth between the realm of the dead and the realm of the living. So of any of the characters who are going to actually die in the story, I think Nicodem has the easiest path to just come back, because it's kind of his whole thing. Now, last but not least, we have Colodi. So we're going to get into a little bit of spoilers here for Ashes and Malifaux stuff, so if you haven't read that story yet and you don't want to be spoiled, then maybe skip over this part. Now, Colodi's a character who we didn't really get a whole lot of background for before it got killed off in the story. But basically what we learn is that Colodi was off in the hills killing people. Colodi's a little bit of a psychopath and likes to just murder people, particularly kids. And apparently it had made a deal with Lucius where it was only going to kill people who would not be missed and be very careful about the people that it killed, so that it didn't cause too much of a problem and it didn't raise too much suspicion, so that Lucius could kind of brush it under the rug. But Colodi basically breaks that deal and decides that it's just going to go off and do whatever it wants, and this raises enough of an issue that Lucius has to actually go do something about it. So he confronts Colodi, and when Colodi does not agree to abide by their deal, Lucius decides that it needs to die. So he sort of tears it apart with his strange beastie claws, because he's some sort of monster. And for whatever reason, once he has destroyed Colodi, he only takes its head. And we get this little scene where he takes the head and puts it on a shelf and kind of adds it to his collection of interesting artifacts and curios in his basement. And just as he does that, the head actually moves, and he tells it that it's not yet time for its last show. So obviously we get an indication there not only that Lucius expects Colodi to come back at some point, but it seems like the head is also still alive or able to move. It moves its eyes and its jaw a little bit. And it's a magic puppet, so I guess there's no reason why it needs its body to animate its head, but magic. But later we actually find out that there's a good reason to believe that Janice from the Explorer Society has the rest of Colodi's body. Now again, I don't know why the guild would have just left the rest of the body sitting in the forest, but apparently they did, and the Explorer Society got their hands on it. And we get confirmation of that because in Ashes of Malifaux we see a scene where Janice actually reveals that she has the body of Colodi. So another indication that there's a way that Colodi might come back in some form or another. Now, I think Colodi is the one who is the biggest wild card of all the 4 masters who were killed off, because it's not really clear why anyone would want to bring Colodi back or what Colodi would be up to if it did come back. I can see a circumstance where Lucius might decide to let Colodi loose as just a sort of chaotic element to sort of destabilize things, because he's obviously kind of on the outs with the guild at the moment, and maybe just having Colodi out there running amok would cause more problems for them and help him sort of manipulate things to put himself back into power. I can also see the Explorer Society benefiting from having Colodi, and maybe they work out a deal where they get the head back from Lucius and Colodi becomes a member of the Explorer Society. I'm not sure why Colodi would want to do that, except to maybe get access to more kids to kill, but I think this all leads back to the fact that we don't really get a lot of development on Colodi's backstory or motivations, so it's hard to say what it would actually want or what it would be doing. I do think that there's enough there that it would be kind of interesting. I think Colodi was a fascinating character, and I think there was a lot more that they could have done with the character, but instead it just kind of got killed and is sitting in a basement rotting. Maybe a more interesting thing is the question of what to do with it in the game, because if Colodi is still the master of the puppet keyword, that is an extremely large keyword, and there's a lot of real shenanigans that Colodi can get up to in 3rd edition with its Dead Man's Hand card. So I'll be curious how they try to balance that or do something different with Colodi's mechanics to try to stop it from being super overpowered and having a giant hiring pool. But it would be kind of cool to see Colodi come back in a different faction, because there's nothing really that ties it to the Neverborn directly, except for the fact that it's kind of been around in Malifaux for a while and theoretically was made by a Neverborn at some point. But that's true of Nexus as well, and Nexus works for the Explorer Society, so there's certainly precedent for that. At the very least, I could see Colodi coming back as an outcast, because it's kind of just like on the periphery doing its own thing and doesn't really have a specific allegiance to anybody. But maybe it just comes back as an Neverborn and sort of works out a deal with Lucius where it goes off and terrorizes people, in which case it kind of just goes back to exactly what it was before Dead Man's Hand, so I kind of don't love that idea. I think if any of these characters come back, we should see them change quite a bit when they do return, and I think the more interesting ways that they interact with their old allies and potentially new allies, I think the better. I definitely don't want to see any one of those 4 characters just come back and be the same as they were before, because then what was the point of this whole process and having the events happen that did? Last up, let's just talk about the elephant in the room really quickly, and that is Ryle Hoffman. Now, I personally don't think that Ryle is going to come back. I think if any of these characters come back, it is much more likely that we'll get all 4 of the other characters back before we'll ever get Ryle back. And the reason that I say that is because he had a very complete story arc, and the story with him and Charles and all the events that took place over the course of 1st and 2nd edition, I think were a really good story. I think they're a really interesting story. And I think if we ever saw Ryle come back, it would really undermine that story and kind of take a lot of the meaning and the weight away from it. Ryle is definitely the character who felt like the most natural death, where at the point where Ryle got eliminated from the story, it felt like the obvious conclusion to that story arc, and that's kind of the way that things were going anyway. It definitely wasn't a surprise when he got eliminated from the game. I think if he got brought back in some way, it would really just be as a way to sort of torture Charles, and my dude has had a rough time, and I don't think he can take any more torture like that, especially when it comes to his brother. But I also don't think that that would make for an interesting story, because it would just be a rehash of the story as it already existed, because that was kind of the whole point of everything that happened up through Shifting Loyalties. So I don't think it would make for an interesting story. I don't think there's a particularly good reason to bring Ryle back. I think that story sort of has a bow on it already, and I think it should stay that way. Rest in peace, Ryle. Hopefully nobody comes and messes with you anymore. But Anna Lovelace is still out there, so, who knows what's going to happen. But anyway, that's all of my thoughts on the characters from Dead Man's Hand and how we might see them come back to the game. Get down in the comments below and let me know what all of you think about all of these ideas and tell me what your ideas are. I know a whole bunch of you already have opinions on this because we've talked about them before on Discord and the comments on previous videos. So get down there and let me know which of these characters you want to see come back the most and how you think that should happen. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not there'll be more Dead Man's Hand or if they'll remove some of these characters from Dead Man's Hand in the future, and personally, I think I would be super excited to see that headline where they announce that any one of these characters is coming back to the game. It would be a really big deal, and again, I think it would bring a lot of old players back into the game potentially, and we get a lot of the veterans really excited about continuing to play some of their favorite characters, especially if you get a cool new version of those characters that look different and have different abilities and stuff. But with that, I want to send a huge thank you to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Pirate Scoundrels, Dogmatized, Devin, and the Spilled Paint Pot, and thanks for watching.